The recording at first is just for our archives, but we might be posting it online as well if there's no problem to anyone. Good afternoon, Daniel. Yeah, up until the end of September, we'll be mostly focused on the. We're mostly focused on the videos for the online seminar, but after that, we'll also be publishing the talks at the conference that we had at the conference here. Anyway, I'll get started since there is some, as I said, some follow stuff to read. And that might give you people some time to join in. Well, welcome everyone to the first encounter of the Museum Without Walls online seminar. Museums Without Walls is an ongoing exploration of virtual art institutions and communities, currently supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, by Queen's University, the Screen Cultures and Curatorial Studies Program, and the Agnes Atherton Arts Center. For this stage of the project, Museum Without Walls has been physically hosted at Queen's University, Ontario. And it's worth remembering that just like many museums across the world, Queen's University is situated on unceded land, the ancestral home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. 2 weeks ago, we had the physical on-site in-person conference here at Queen's. And this online seminar program is one way to extend it and perhaps make the most of our post-COVID situation, post-COVID situation, trying to incorporate some sort of online participation into the conference program so that we can open space for more participation and more people to present their projects, and also to continue the conversation in another channel. These online seminars take place every Thursday, 2 p.m. EST until the end of September. And the idea is for all the audience to watch the presentations in advance, and then we have more time here to discuss them without the burden of timekeeping or trying to, be very, try to cram too much in an online Zoom, or maybe even to pay attention to a Zoom meeting that might always be a burden in a way. Today, we'll be discussing 4 presentations under the topic of materials of memory. We have here Places, Constructing the Site of Memory Through Transmedia Exhibition by Yi Song from the University of Cambridge. The Expanded Gallery Experience, Documentation and Simulated Presence in Olafur Eliasson's Your Uncertain Archive by Olivia Eriksson from the Stockholm University. Playing the Past, Using WebXR to Rebuild the Lost City by Emily Godden, Anglia Ruskin University. And Accessing the Antarctic Through Storytelling and Immersive Technologies by Leslie Johnston, also from Anglia Ruskin University. And I'll be also reading our panelists' short bios. Ying Song was an assistant research fellow at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, and is now a student of MPhil in Film and Screen Studies at the University of Cambridge. Her research interests revolve around films, community museums, and media representation. Her previous research focuses on the way transmedia storytelling engages local communities and constructs community museums. She also participated in a project on reconstructing a Chinese museum in the VR environment to resolve travel difficulties during the pandemic. In addition to her academic works, her transmedia project on a Chinese intangible cultural heritage was displayed in an exhibition about the Ningbo Bang community. She's also an amateur film critic. Olivia Eriksson is a postdoctoral research fellow in cinema studies at the Department of Media Studies, Stockholm University, where her research centers around the moving image within an art context, particularly in relation to questions of embodiment and site specificity. Her dissertation, Gallery Experience, Viewers, Screens, and the Space in Between in Contemporary Installation Art, examines the situated viewing practices of film installations in a gallery setting. Ericsson's current research project focuses on the cinematic image as a social situation, starting from curatorial processes in contemporary moving image art. Emily Gordon is a PhD student with the Story Lab Research Institute and BA Digital Media Production lecturer at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. She has an MA in printmaking, and her current PhD study is called Spectres and Sebald, a practice-led investigation into interactive storytelling and environmental heritage to rebuild the lost city of Dunwich. Outside of academia, Emily runs a social enterprise, Virtually Their Studio CIC, to support humans in East Anglia with digital literacy and creative skills to aid well-being. And finally, Leslie Johnson is a narrative designer with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust and a KTP Research Associate within Storylab at Anglia Ruskin. Previously, she was a freelance heritage visualizations and photogrammetry consultant. Leslie holds an MSc in Heritage Visualization from Glasgow School of Art, the School of Simulated and Visualization. Her current role involves concepting, design, and development of an interactive, immersive Antarctic experience. Well, once again, thank you all for participating in this alternative panel, online panel format. Sorry if I read anything wrong. Again, this is not really my computer, so maybe something got lost in the copy paste. Yes, it's such a pleasure to have you all here. I invite you, any guests and attendees, to already, well, post questions to the chat or maybe raise your hand if you have any pressing questions that you want to discuss about the projects that are on topic today. But as I said, I myself have some questions because all of these topics are very much of my interest, and they relate very much to the first stage of Museum Without Walls that took place last year, more connected to a museum in Brazil, both in terms of the concepts that we'll be discussing here today, but also in terms of methods. And the panel today talks about materials of memory, and I think that one of the biggest concerns is actually the state of what a document might be using these new technologies, and how useful, how accessible, and how relatable these documents might be. At the same time, how the documents themselves might be performative, and what we win or what we lose at the same time when we admit this dimension of performativity to our elements or modes of evidence, perhaps. And this might be some deeper questions to address as the panel goes by. But I'd like to start maybe with one quick question for each of you to get the conversation going. And if I may start with E, who presented the work Faces, Places, and how we had this very interesting connection, I guess. At first, an intervention in public space, in facades, using temporary ephemeral material, but at the same time that was connected to other dimensions of mediation, for example, through the documentary itself, but also through all the social media activity that normally takes place around these public interventions. And I think that the social media activity has been part of the reason why works such as JR's are successful, but also they have given public performance and public projection performance an interesting life during the pandemic and during, well, the last few years. Just to give you an example, there is a project in Brazil right now called, I can't remember the exact name, but I think it's Projetação. And they are always projecting things on the same wall, which I guess is the side of a building right in front of where one of the members live. But the thing is that at the same time they project these slogans, these images there, they have an Instagram account where these images are fed into. And this gives what should have been a very local intervention into public discourse, and also in a way, the economies of memory and representation of Brazilian politics, another reach, because these images, in a way, they become viral, they become memes, and they spread across the internet. So you have this combination of two different kinds of mediation working together in order to create perhaps a new materiality for memory. And my question to you, Ying, to try to open the works today, is how much you see it laying in JR's project. So what's the role of the audiovisual mediations in what should be a very local, material, tangible, and physical intervention in local spaces?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And first, I must say that JR's works rely on the physical place and physical environment to create those murals and those poetries of local people, because his idea is basically to engage the local faces, the local community into the indigenous environment. So people can recognize that what conditions are they in, and what social issues are they currently facing. But because of the existence of social media, I think more people can be aware of the community problems that some marginalized areas are facing. And so as a result, I think that social media can really help those people who do not who are not familiar with those marginalized areas to know those social issues and help to protest for something. And also those images can be a material for those visual activism online. And I would like also to refer to Leslie's work because her presentation is about the VR reconstruction of Atlantic. It is an example of how people who are not familiar with the Atlantic can get familiar and get knowledge about those areas they can never reach. And this problem become more and more obvious in the period of pandemic. Yeah, that's my answer. Thank you.
That's great, though, but that's also an interesting comparison between accessing or getting close or reaching out to these people, or how they can perhaps reach out to a wider audience, and these very isolated places that most of us will never know in person, such as the Antarctic. If anyone wants to respond to anything, by the way, feel free. I'll try to move on slowly with questions, but again, the chat and the raise hand functions might also help us try to, organize ourselves. But thanks so much, yes. So moving on now to the work of Olivia and the expanded gallery. I found it fascinating, and it's one of the works that perhaps among ours here connects more directly with the intentions and the first stages of Museums Without Walls, and this idea of representing artworks in a different way, which normally means reconfiguring these works completely and perhaps even losing what they might convey originally in order to provide some access. And I think it's very interesting when you raise this idea of the documentation as a critical space, and what exactly this can mean in terms both positive and negative to the work, and how a project can move us away from the archival record, and in that sense provoke a shift in the authority around the archive, or I mean the control over the work itself. And I was wondering if you could perhaps expand a bit on how that works in the case of your Uncertain Archive, but also how you see it applied to other examples that you might see in your research or in other situations.
Yeah, sure, I can try. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I'm also really fascinated by how documentary records can all of a sudden, as I say in the presentation, sort of enter into the aesthetic realm and become artworks in themselves. And this very much taps into a larger sort of motion going on within the contemporary art scene, a motion that engages with archival material in various ways. Hal Foster has written a very influential article about this in the beginning of the 2000s, I think. So I can see it pop up in several instances, and also quite often in relation actually to the specificities of a local community to tie into Yi's presentation, and maybe we can talk more about that later. But in Eliasson's case, I think it's fascinating that I mean, I've always been very, the idea or the notion of sight has always been of great interest to me. And I guess I might be sort of approaching this theme from a somewhat different angle than some of the other participants in this seminar, because I very much treasure the sight, and installation art builds on that embodied presence to enter into a physical space. So I think it's really interesting that an artist such as Olafur Eliasson focuses so much on making his works accessible in online space. And I seem to have forgotten exactly what your question was, but I tried to sort of expand on several of the threads that you raised, but you be more than welcome to repeat if there was something specific, that because I feel that like I missed an essential part of your question there. So
I think the end point was the shift in authority and what exactly this means, or what this can mean. Especially when we consider that perhaps the artist themselves is offering this other way of archival or representation of their own work. And in that sense, do you also feel that they are forfeiting some of their authority? They are inviting other readings from the larger public. They are perhaps inviting agonistic or antagonical or oppositional readings from the wider public, and how this plays into artists' careers and works more broadly.
In this case, I think definitely not. I think it's the opposite. It's a way of introducing the artworks to the audience and making sure that when they are on site, they will experience them in the correct manner, so to say, even though I'm sure that this artists and artists in general are very sort of keen to point out that it's in the eye of the beholder, and you sort of direct your own experience, but it's always that balance between a directed experience and the chance encounter you get with the artwork. So in terms of authority, I think the authority is very much present also in this archive, definitely. So it's more like guiding the future gallery visitor or the spectators, I would say.
Yes, thanks so much, Olivia, especially for going back to my very particular point. But that was great, and I think that you already raised some interesting questions that are a good segue into the one that I had to Emily, which relates to this notion of embodiment, because I feel that most of these projects, especially if we're thinking about mixed reality at large, at the same time that they are representing something, some space, some site, some object or collection of objects, they are also creating a vessel, a representation for the audience itself, as artists, as art, as often done in a way. Like when you have a perspective projection, you are presupposing or you're creating like this invisible eye for the audience to fit in. And I think that Emily's concern about avatars in Mozilla Hub especially really resonated with me, because I had lots of trouble, and I still have when I use hubs in activities, classes or whatever. And I feel that the process of creating an avatar is always a great way to get people, to give people a better sense of inhabiting themselves that space. But hubs doesn't give you that easy of a route into doing that. And I was super curious. Maybe I'm calling for spoilers into Emily's PhD, but I was super curious about what you've been thinking about it since you evoked that in the end of your presentation.
I think how you're represented. So a lot of your research is obviously into the creation of the virtual heritage and that virtual space. But I think what's kind of missed out a lot, and often it's a very solitary, isolated experience in those virtual spaces. And coming at it from like an interest in video games and that space, they're typically the opposite. You are normally inhabiting a space with other humans, but you're typically not doing that as yourself, whether that's in an RPG, fantasy world, whatever it is. You normally have an avatar. Some people craft those to look exactly like themselves, but some people use those to be the person they can't be in the real world. And what was fascinating about hubs is that ability to be like an astronaut and defy physics, which is really nice in virtual spaces. You can defy gravity, which can be a bit of a nuisance sometimes when you're especially creating virtual exhibitions. And it's a fascinating space for having conversations in, and having a space where you can typically, there can be, you have to be careful because obviously there could be potential safeguarding concerns and risks about that. So you have to ensure that there is some sort of gatekeeping element in there. I'm sure we've all been on a Zoom that's been Zoom bombed and that sort of thing. So there is some sort of element, you have to sort of be careful in that way. But like, I remember very early on using Mozilla for a Halloween party with students, and there were characters coming as Jigsaw and like all these spooky characters and everything. And it was fascinating because this was at a point where we'd been online teaching and everyone had their webcams off, and I totally respect that. I get that. I would have my webcam off if I wasn't speaking. But that idea of presence and that feeling like, okay, it doesn't matter that I'm talking to a floating panda. There's that sense of connection with floating panda, and we could be talking about something very serious, deep and meaningful, but it just feels like there's someone there. And Hub's characters, if you've paid attention to them when they're speaking, there are some of those sort of body language cues that you might get from an actual human. So I think it's interesting, and that there is the editor where you could create your own sort of avatar and customize it. I've done experiences where I've made uniforms for people for an exhibition so that they know I can go to that avatar and ask about the virtual exhibition because they've got a uniform, and they're just like in a real one, you ask a gallery human, can you tell me more about this work? So you could identify them in a sea of other weird and wonderful avatars. So yeah, I think you can do lots, but it can be a bit like with any digital platform, like navigating it for the first time can be a bit confusing, especially when it generates, if no one's used it, you get auto-generated like a random name as well, as auto-selected a random character. So you don't always know what your avatar looks like until someone says, do you know you're wearing a Christmas jumper?
No, yeah, the selection that they have at the basic rooms is quite something. There's some gifs of people dancing that are my favorite ones currently. I just find hard to find a good customizable option, especially when you're getting, I mean, I'm terrible at 3D stuff as well, you know, like modeling and stuff. But when you're getting people who have no experience in that and they just wanted like some sort of menu-driven solution for representing themselves or someone else at a space, and Hubs still not offers that, it can be a bit jarring. But I mean, it's perhaps my favorite platform currently. And also maybe an interesting segue to the question I had for Leslie, which maybe are two questions, and I hope that they are not too dry and technical, but one relates to the challenges of doing photogrammetry in the Antarctic. And I don't know if you have also been capturing landscapes as well, but I imagine that since everything is kind of white and also reflexive, that might be difficult to deal with in terms of data acquisition for volumes and everything. And the other question was more maybe a technical minutia, but since you and Emily come from the same laboratory and her project is using Hubs, and I realized that I perceived that your project is using Unity. So what informed each of these decisions in each of the cases? In the case for you, why not hubs? I mean, I can think of some reasons, but anyway.
Okay, good questions. Well, we start with the second one first. Why not hubs? There's no reason why not hubs. We're looking for an immersive environment. Unity is just the first way in which we've chosen to access that. Emily and I are actually working together on a slightly different project to test an environment in Mozilla. So there could also be Antarctica coming to you via Mozilla very soon, depending on how it goes, Emily? Unity gives us the opportunity to get the environment that we want along with the content that we want from the archives, and to embed enough interaction for it to be an immersive experience. And in part, it's a pragmatic answer of, I've used Unity before. So it seems like, you use the tools that you've got and the ones that you're good at. So it's quite a pragmatic answer. In terms of the data collection in Antarctica, I'm both lucky and unlucky that I've not been the one that had to undertake that so far, because it is a very challenging thing to do. They have captured some of the environment, which, as you say, is white. So there's lots of albedo, there's lots of deflection from the snow and from the glass and from some of the material properties of the huts. So they're incredibly challenging both for photogrammetry and laser scanning, which has been undertaken. And the interior of the buildings poses additional challenges because most of the buildings we have, they're heritage buildings that haven't been in use for 30 years plus, so they don't have lighting. And if you're lucky, you've got enough time to get on site, take the shutters off the window so you've got some natural light, and then you've got time to take a good data set. But they're working in very extreme environments, and they've got to fit the schedule of whichever ship has transported them to the island at that time. So they don't always have a lot of time. So it's a get in there and do the best that you can with what you've got kind of situation. And unlucky because I would love to try and do that. Hopefully in the future, we'll see. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. I mean, I can imagine it must be something really intimidating. When I saw the images and I kept thinking about all the problems that the issues behind doing this kind of capture. I mean, I can't even start to imagine, in fact.
Yeah, but there's many. I mean, the weather, the light, whether your hands shake and then you don't get a good capture.
Of course, yeah.
Some of our sites have a lot of penguins running around. And if you're trying to capture the environment and you've got all these penguins and they won't stand still for the laser scan, so you've always got half a penguin and then you've got a penguin that looks a bit flat. And then, and so in order to get the environment right, there's even more manual work that has to be done or will have to be done to make that look correct. So in addition to processing the data and optimizing it and cleaning it and potentially retopologizing, you get to a point you just think, should I just make this from scratch? Should we just get rid of all the penguins, get rid of all the stones and just start from scratch? But part of what we're trying to do, as with I think all the other projects here, is to be honest about the original data set and to have that sort of integrity that what people are seeing is what is there to at least a good degree. So yeah, it's a lot of challenges that we're attempting to overcome, but they're good. It's good challenges.
Amazing. That's adorable. Like penguins messing up with your data sets. That's.
If they would just stand still, would be okay, but no.
Anyway, these are actually very good problems, actually, like how much of the indexical trace we need to preserve in these projects that are trying to represent these works in a completely different, at the same time more similar, but at the same time more distant situation from the original. And I wonder how the other projects also deal with it, in a sense, like, because you always have to go through some sort of adaptation or post-production in order to bring the originals, so say, into the representational framework, which might mean cleaning data, which might be enlarging something in order to make it visible. A lot of times when you're moving into the web, it means simplifying models. I wonder if any of the other projects, or even you, Leslie, have some particular guidelines into making this decision. So what is irrelevant for documentation and what must be preserved as we virtualize things or mediate things? And anyone who wants to jump in the question, please do.
I'm happy to jump in to kill the awkward silence.
Thank you, Emily.
So one of the reasons I went for looking and working with WebXR was Unity's great, it's amazing, but the outputs from it, I mean, you can get WebGL so that it would run in the web browser, but you do, whilst you do sacrifice, it's like spinning plates. What do you have to sacrifice in order to meet the needs of your target audience? And I think all the works are looking at different target audiences, or there's this idea of opening it up to new audiences and removing these gatekeepers and stuff. And this idea that I think I've forgotten the statistics, but there was I think of 20,000 papers in the sort of virtual heritage space. Eric Champion found 3 of them had you could access the actual 3D files, and of those 3 they weren't in a file format that existed anymore or something. So working in the WebXR space and adopting open standards and working with open source software so that it is sustainable, and it's not typically in the immersive space things become quite redundant quite quickly, and it'd be interesting to see maybe for Eliasson's already come across this in some old projects, how you preserve the technologies that are preserving the work. Eric Champion says that the virtual heritage shouldn't die before the actual heritage disappears. It should outlive it. I'm quite lucky in that dunnage is disappearing quite fast, so I don't have to make the digital heritage last that long. But this idea about how do you ensure what you've made lasts, because Olafur Eliasson's work capturing melting glaciers and stuff, that archive, but that image unfortunately is going to last longer than the glacier. So how you sort of make sure that your work's sustainable in the age of sort of climate crisis is kind of driving a lot of those decisions on why you keep certain things, because server space can be restricted and it takes up a lot of energy. So that's kind of guiding some of my decisions. It's mostly audience and sustainability to meet those sorts of needs. I'd be interested to hear how other people sort of make those decisions, because it can feel difficult. You want to be equitable and accessible and inclusive, but you're always going to have to make those tough choices, and it's difficult.
I think for our project with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, we're quite lucky because we're taking data from the archive. We're not archiving, we're not creating the content for the archive. We're creating something experiential from it. So the data is not going anywhere, and any of the data that we do collect automatically goes into that archive. So in its raw form, it will be protected. For us, it's more choosing what to focus on in order to make people interested, in order to get people to have that sort of spark of interest, because we need people's support in order to do our jobs, which is to maintain the sites and their material form. But people can't do that if they don't know about it yet. So we're sort of working backwards from Emily in many ways. I think it's quite a different question for perhaps Olivia, because the way that the artist has been recreating their own work from the presentation, I think that's a completely different take, because that's an artist taking their own work and then they're giving you a new, different perspective, which made me wonder, why is this a retrospective from the artist, and that they've decided to give it, the artwork, a perspective from, you know, the perspective of the plant? Or is this them trying to give the audiences something new? I think there's a lot about perspective and what you're wanting to do with that data that could bring about some interesting discussion.
Yeah, I would say in my research, I've had the opposite problem, that I want to keep a lot of the distractions, if you will, that aren't actually a part of the artwork, but which in my mind are essential to understanding what it's like to visit the gallery, which has been sort of what I've been focusing on. So the institutional framework, the co-actors or my fellow gallery visitors, and in film studies, there's been, like, traditionally, there's been this understanding that gallery spectatorship is it's individual, it's not social, but actually it's very social, because you have to always adjust according to your fellow gallery visitors. And all those things, they never end up in the documentation, or rarely. And I would say that Eliasson is an exception in that sense, that he really wants to capture, like, all of the different variables that feed into this on-site experience in the documentation. But of course, it's a matter of self-representation, although his studio is, I think he has like 100 employees or something. So it's really a collaborative effort. It's not like one artist, but he is a big star, of course, and it's his name on it. So yeah, but
yeah, actually, I'm also thinking about why, like, Eliasson use those non-human perspectives that we usually don't see in the documentation. And it reminds me that in the sustainable movement in recent years, like, people, they no longer focus on the sustainability of their own lives and their own resource, but they also turn to the sustainability of other plants or animals, and also some resource on the earth. So I think maybe the non-human perspectives in Eliasson's works correspond to this kind of trend. Like, when people they notice things that are not themselves, they can turn the viewpoint from themselves, their own experience, to things that exist in the museum space. And maybe they can have some kind of new experience and new enlightenment.
There was a quote that I might have written down wrong from your presentation, Yi, which was, photographs provide tools for memory work to reconstruct and reinterpret the meaning of past experiences. And my handwriting's so terrible I can't read the author's name, but it was 2010. Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting, that idea of memory, in that everything across all the sort of speakers' kind of work, and it being this sort of gateway into something else. And the idea, although like some may have ideas or interests around authenticity, which is like quite a loaded and interesting thing in itself, but this idea that when like there were these sort of tagged categories in that archive that Eliasson had created, and that there was that idea you could sort of create your own, and one person's viewpoint and perspective might be totally different to another, and that ability to be playful when normally things are quite locked down and quite fixed, and you can have these sort of different perspectives, I thought was kind of interesting. It's not a question, it's just like a kind of comment, I guess, across.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm also thinking about it, like how when we document certain kinds of places, or when we document certain period of memories, we are always selective, but rather than being an objective observer, Like when Anis Varda, he documents the process of conducting the public art project of JR. She always selects those delightful or those joyful moments when those villagers, they would like to collaborate with the artists to create the memory work. But those other like frightening or those undelightful moments are left out in the documentation. So I think that documentation of memories is always selective, like everyone can create their own version of memory. But when we see those documentations, we must observe those kind of different angles, and those are only subjective versions of certain memories.
Subjectivity is an interesting point, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, everyone's work, almost everything that we're doing, certainly the 4 presentations here, we're creating a new output through a medium of ourselves and our own biases, as he says, from something which originated from someone else or somewhere else. I think that's why I keep coming back to, I apologize if I mispronounce this, Eliason? Close enough. And the way that the way that we're quite removed from the thing that we're trying to represent, either in time or place. But Eliasson is representing a different perspective of the same thing that someone might have seen before, which got me thinking about audiences, and who the audience that was created for. Is it new perspective for someone who has already been to that installation to look at and see it from a new perspective and have a deeper understanding? Or is it specifically for new audiences who haven't seen it in person? Or is it a bit of both? Who are we making these things for and why is always two very interesting questions that can take you off on a good tangent.
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's a bit of both, but I think that that ties into something that I wanted to ask Yi also, that you just raised when I looked at your presentation, which I very much appreciated. I got to thinking about like works that involve local communities. You always have to consider the role of the artist. And you talked a little bit about that now, and also you mentioned it toward the end of your presentation. And I thought it would be really interesting if you would care to like develop your thoughts more on this aspect, because artistic collaborations with local communities has become quite common in contemporary art, and there's always this matter of applying an outside perspective, and also perhaps running a risk that the artist overplays their own role, or maybe works on behalf of an art institution doing commission work. So going back maybe to that question of authority that we talked about initially in relation to the work that you're researching right now. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on that if you.
It's a minefield. It's a challenging minefield. Obviously, we're trying to it's a very small team, and we're trying to recreate somewhere that most of the technical side of the team have never been. So we're using the resources to try and understand both the physical place in terms of its shape, the archive and the stories and the reports to understand what went on, but also to try and understand the sort of sense of place, what it looked like, what it felt like. Was it cold all the time? Were people happy? How did people get on? There's so many layers of experience that we want to try and share with people that we don't fully understand. And as you say, the working with communities is a very popular thing now, and quite rightly so. But that's useful if you're there and you can speak directly to the community, and the community are in situ with your place. At the moment, we're talking about sites that, as I mentioned, haven't, only one of the 6 sites is habited, and that's only for a few months of the year. what I do know is, whilst it's very hard for us to ensure that we're making a true representation of location and place, there is a club or network of the people who have lived and worked in Antarctica. And if we get anything wrong, they will let us know. So, so there's scope for artistic opportunities, and there's going to have to be, because we can't make everything completely as it was, not only on account of not having the data, but in terms of the technical restrictions and time restrictions of sharing something like a VR experience, especially if it's for a school, because you can't have, you know, kids in VR for an hour, 2 hours at a time. It has to be quite contained, so you have to get to the point. But yes, there's a line to be walked between artistic opportunity and sticking to the being honest to the content, I think. I don't know how Ian and Emily feel about their projects with that terms of authenticity and integrity of some, if integrity the same, the word that I'm looking for.
Well, Yi, in your presentation, you're also talking about an artist sort of interpreting the history and the memories of local narratives or a local community. So is this something that you've been thinking about when approaching this work and these images?
Yeah, I think that before or now the new museology, like museums or artists, they undertake the role of being the transmitter of knowledge. Like they always want to teach something to the public or like transmit some kinds of knowledge to the public. But now the role have overturned. Like now it's like the community or the public teach something to the artists and makes artists give voice to them. So I think this is really a good turn that the artists can care more about their communities and have an opportunity to contribute to the community and improve the like living standard or improve some kinds of knowledge of the certain local communities. Yeah, and for Leslie's project, I really like the VR videos that provided in your presentation. I think it's really immersive, and it's like a real scene in Atlantic. And I'm thinking that how you use this VR video to this VR installation to access those young people, or they do something in the VR installation and to know the knowledge of Atlantic.
Yeah, I think it's important that we everything should be done for the purpose. I can't remember who said the words, to avoid technical obsolescence. You don't want to make something just with the technology because you can. It has to have meaning and be doing something useful. So certainly in our case, we want to share the heritage of the sites and the stories before they fade away, because we're still at a point where we can come up with experience and then share that with children and get them excited and get them to partake in the protection of the sites, potentially get them talking to people who work there. So it's a bit of an intergenerational opportunity here that would be quite exciting to investigate further if we can get the project extended. I did think when I was listening to the end of Olivia's presentation that there was something that you said, and let me know if I misinterpreted this. You summarized that the documentation shifted away from the original event, I think almost becoming its own. The documentation became an object in and of itself, worthy of consideration. And you talked about how scale was used at some point, and I was contrasting that with Yi's, how scale was also used in the facades of the murals, but how the output from Olivia's artist almost became its own event, but from E's, it's taken you back to the original. So you've almost got the same thing is happening, but you've got two different outputs. One is that you've got a new creation, and the other one is taking you back in time. I just thought that divergence was quite interesting. I should probably ask questions and not just make profound statements.
No, that was a great comment. And I think it kind of relates to the conversation we were having previously about like the connections between the artist and the community, because it has to do with this tension between the representation of whatever it is itself, and what is maybe being evoked or left behind. But I just want to ask open space for Renee, who is his hand raised.
Sorry, I was super late. I had a meeting. When I was watching your presentation, Leslie, I remember you saying that you were looking for collaborations. What types of collaborations are you looking for? What kind of people are you interested in, and how one would get in contact with you for that?
Well, we're open to any kind of project that we could undertake that would help with a charity. So we're always trying to spread the word and sort of make contact, and we're hoping to get involved in a lot more public engagement. So that there's a wealth of potential opportunities. I don't know what kind of sector you're at or coming from. There are potential collaborations if we can move on from this project or expand this project into new partnerships, reaching new audiences, different skill sets that we might utilize. There's a wealth. I will pop the UKHT info email into the chat box, and you can ping us an email and we can have a chat.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm in art history and curation, but I've also worked in recreation of virtual spaces and things like that. So that's what I was like really interested in what you're doing. Thank you.
No worries. Cheers.
Awesome. We're moving closer to the end, folks. We might still have time for another chat question. So if anyone wants to ask anything, just type or show up on camera. In any case, I wanted to do one of these broad final questions that might be useful for everyone, which is, where are your projects going to after this stage that you just presented? And where can we hear more about them? Could perhaps follow the same order. So starting with E.
I'm not quite sure, actually. I just write it as one of my course essay, and I really like the article, so I submitted to this conference. So maybe if I have opportunities, I may find a journal to publish it, but I don't know yet.
And are you planning on doing research similar to it for next projects, for your thesis or something, or that was just one-off thing?
Yeah, for my MPhil thesis, I'm also thinking about the relationship between moving images and the memories. So maybe I will also work towards this direction.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Olivia?
Well, thanks. I just started this postdoc project of mine, so it's still a bit unclear for me as well where it will be, in which direction it's going. But I wrote quite extensively about Ólafur Eliasson in my dissertation. So if anyone is interested, you could find that online. And now I'm focusing more on like social relations in contemporary art during the pandemic and what that meant, and how we deal with the idea of sight as remotely present, which was a concept that I learned watching Emily's presentation. I thought it was really interesting from like a philosophical point of view, like how are we remotely present? And I look forward to exploring that further. And yeah. Can I just say, going back really quickly to what Leslie said previously, I think it's fascinating that although we have different topics, of course, we're all sort of dealing with remains in one form or another, or whether it be murals or video documentation of ruins or remnants. So we're all dealing with that materiality of memory that, which is the title, of course, of this panel, but I thought it was really a good job to put us all together, although our presentations are quite different. So I really appreciated taking part of your work.
Remains is a great word. Thanks for that. Emily, sorry.
So for the work on dunnage, hopefully I finish my PhD before it completely disappears. I mean, I should, there's still a chunk of it left, but most of it is underwater. I'm only part-time, so I've got, I think January 2026. So you've got to be mega patient for anything, but I'm probably sharing like papers and stuff before then. And it's interesting, the site of Greyfriars has a really peculiar history in that it was quite trendy in the Victorian era to sort of generate ruins, not like artificial ruins. And Greyfriars was this medieval friary, became a prison, became a town hall. And then in the Victorian time, they were like, no, we're just going to let it become a ruin because that's kind of interesting. And then someone built a side on it to make it look much bigger than it really is. And so it has that kind of interesting history in that ruin was deliberate, and normally you think, oh, something must have happened, like a fire, or normally something, it could have been half of it fell into the sea, which is the main reason you would think it's a ruin. It's not, it was pure purpose that made it look the way. I mean, one of the walls did fall down a couple of years ago, but that was just because it was left continuously to fall over. So I think that's interesting, that the ideas around conservation and preservation, and that actually sometimes we should, you normally don't want to do the opposite of deliberately sort of destroying things, which is quite.
Thanks, Leslie.
We're hoping that this project will be proof of concept. To take another of Emily's words and run with it, sustainability is something that we're moving towards, or hoping to. So we're hoping that the digital outputs we might create, this being an example, will help us become more financially capable of making more. So we're hoping it will be self-propelling. So we should be finishing up this project next year. And if all goes well, there may be opportunity to expand to our other sites after that. And then you could end up with a huge open world VR Antarctica some point in the future, which would be pretty amazing. But that's far down the line.
Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone, for participating in this seminar today. I hope you all come back next week. We will have a panel, Institutional Leaks, with the participation of Antoinette Lafarge, Karin de Wilde, and Nadeska Povroznik. I hope I pronounced that right. Lia Carrera, who is or was here at the audience, and Renee, who is here with us. Yes. So yeah, I mean, if everyone is interested, we can also find a way to share everyone's email at the end or as we go along, so that we can kind of come closer to a sort of conference, in-person conference like networking situation, where we can just continue lots of these conversations as we move along with our project. I know that I have lots to converse to all of you about very sometimes specific things, and I bet that you also do. So maybe we'll reach out to all the participants at some point. But for now, again, thanks so much for our presenters for today. Yi, Olivia, Emily, and Leslie. And I hope to see you all next week for another session of the seminar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
The ranking is